Let me ask before I begin, how many of you are visiting Arizona for the first time? Wow, that's practically everybody. That's incredible. How many of you are visiting the American Southwest for the first time? Ah, that's fantastic. Welcome to the land of freedom. Seriously, the West is the poetic image of freedom in the American mind. Freedom yearns for the sunset horizon. So this is the land of the sunset horizon, so welcome. Also, I didn't bring enough for everybody, but I wanted to mention, I brought these little bookmarks. I set them on some of your seats. I ran out because I didn't know there were that many of you. But this is about a little project we just did at the Goldwater Institute, a little children's book that we've published that's called A is for the American Dream, because so much of modern culture is aimed at teaching children, particularly black children, that the American dream is not for them, that this is a white supremacist nation that was rooted in white supremacy to the degree that they are not part of our culture and were never intended to be, which I think is a grotesque and evil concept. And I hope you would take a moment to look at this book, which is an alternative to that, and says the American dream is for everybody. Everybody has a fundamental right to pursue happiness, and this country should be very proud of the fact that it is based on that fundamental principle. Welcome to Arizona, to those of you for whom it is new, which is not only my adopted home state, but also the adopted home state of Frank Lloyd Wright, America's greatest visual artist. Now that's a big claim, and I can't hope to defend it in the amount of time that I have, or even to cover all of Wright's career, which spanned many decades and many phases. And also any effort to try that would be complicated by the fact that Wright was a deeply flawed man whose philosophical ideas were vague, whose autobiography is misleading, and who often expressed himself in aphorisms that prioritized sound over sense. He liked to play the magician, and sometimes that meant saying things that actually don't mean anything. Pick a passage at random from one of his books, and you're more likely to be mystified than enlightened. For example, quote, "As a pebble cast into the ocean sets up reactions lost in the faint encircling ripples of vast distances of eternity, so does a man's genius go on forever. For genius is but an expression of principle. Therefore, in no way does genius ever run counter to genius, nor ever could. It is itself a human element, nature." This is not really comprehensible. But the fact that Wright's ideas were a mixture of good and bad, and that he often enjoyed a good pun more than expressing his ideas clearly, does not mean that he was not an artistic genius. He certainly was that. With these limits in mind, what I want to do is offer you some basic ideas that will help you appreciate Wright's achievements as an architect, which were tremendous. Frank Lloyd Wright revolutionized architecture. His influence is so vast that we often don't even notice how much of our built environment stands in his shadow. Perhaps the closest he ever came to expressing the essence of his work came in a remark in 1931, quote, "Mankind is only now waking to visions of the machine as the true emancipator of the individual," he said. "Therefore, we may yet see the machine age as the age of a true democracy, wherein human life is based squarely on and in the beauty and fruitfulness of the ground, life lived in the full enjoyment of the earth line of human life, the line of freedom for man, whereby man's horizon may be immeasurably extended by the machine, the creature of his brain in the service of his heart and mind." As these words suggest, one of the pivotal themes of Wright's artistic career was the relationship between humanity and technology. Keep in mind that in his 91-year life, Wright witnessed the most extraordinary transformations humanity has ever experienced. When he was born in Wisconsin in 1867, the tallest structure in the world, can we put the display? Yeah, the tallest structure in the world was France's Cathedral of Our Lady of Strasbourg, which is 466 feet high and was finished in the year 1439. When he died here in Phoenix in 1959, that record was held by the Empire State Building, which is 3 times as tall and was built in a single year. Wright was 2 when the Transcontinental Railroad was completed, and almost 40 when the Model T went on sale. By the time he died, the space race was underway, and human beings orbited the Earth only 2 years later. When he was born, American architects were using elaborate styles such as the Queen Anne and the Italianate. By the time he died, architects were building houses like this and office towers like this. Now, biographers think that Wright began building on his family farm when he was young, but it was in 1886 that he entered the University of Wisconsin to study architecture. He did not graduate. In fact, he never got a degree, and he never got an architecture license. Instead, he moved to Chicago to work for a friend of his uncle, and in 1887, he had his big break, because that was the year he began working for the firm of Adler and Sullivan and met the man who would become his mentor, Louis Sullivan. Sullivan is remembered today as the father of the skyscraper. He did not invent the skyscraper, but he created the aesthetics of tall building architecture. He was brilliant and enigmatic, and he embodied some of the best qualities of 19th century America: boldness, innovation, intense individualism, which he thought should be expressed through buildings that spoke of enterprise and dynamism. You can get a sense of his aesthetics from his memoir, The Autobiography of an Idea. Quote, "The only sound social fabric is ego. The I am, the unique, the most precious of man's powers, with their source and summation in diversity. Without ego, which is life, man vanishes. Ego signifies identity. It is the free spirit. It is the sign and symbol of man's immense integrity. Our dream shall be a civilization founded upon ideas thrillingly sane. A civilization that shall be the living voice, the spring song, the saga of the power of man's ego to banish fear and hate, and in the courage of adventure and mastership to shape his destiny," end quote. I love Sullivan's writing, and I very much encourage you to read his memoir. Sullivan's artistic hero was Walt Whitman, whose long free verse poems celebrated individuality and democracy, with democracy meaning not government by the majority or even the lowest common denominator, but the liberation of the individuality of all mankind. Democracy, said Louis Sullivan, means lifting the eyelids of the world. Sullivan channeled his individualism into art by devising two especially important principles that he would transmit to his disciple Frank Lloyd Wright. The first was the artistic significance of the arch. In his book, Kindergarten Chats, which consists of a series of philosophical dialogues with a student, probably Frank Lloyd Wright, Sullivan explained that in the past, architecture had been based on the pier and the lintel, or the post and lintel, straight lines that only seemed to express authoritarianism and limited the height and strength of buildings. But the arch was something else. Of all constructive forms, Sullivan said, the most emotional is the arch, because under man's hand it becomes what he wills. Romans used the arch, he admitted, but they held it in bondage. And although Chinese and Hindu architects had dimly grasped its spiritual significance, it was only in free democratic America that we could use it to its full advantage. The reason was that the arch expresses triumph over an abyss. This is a quote, "It is a form against fate. Fate, as we say, ever most relentlessly seeks its destruction. Yet does the arch rise in power so graciously, floating through the air from abutment to abutment, that it seems ever to me a symbol and epitome of our own ephemeral span." That is, life itself. Some of Sullivan's greatest work as an architect employed arches in extraordinarily graceful ways, such as the golden doorway of his transportation building and the windows of his incredible National Farmers Bank. Wright actually disagreed a bit with Sullivan on this point. Although Wright used arches prominently in some of his work, for instance, the Dana Thomas House in 1904 and the V.C. Morris gift shop 45 years later, he believed that instead of the arch, the true individualistic and futuristic architectural form was the cantilever. The cantilever is formed when a vertical weight carries the load of a horizontal extension, thus allowing the extension to reach out into space, seeming to float in thin air. This conveys a sense of weightlessness and flight, but horizontally rather than vertically. It flies, but it remains within reach of the earth. And it's natural in an important sense. The most obvious example of a cantilever is a leaf, which is held at the stem on one end and sticks out over space at the other end. But while Wright preferred the cantilever to the arch, he shared with his teacher the idea that structural forms can express abstractions, that the basic engineering of a building can express a sense of life, and specifically the spirit of freedom and independence. Sullivan's next great lesson for Wright was that architecture is a form of poetry. Now, I've mentioned that Sullivan admired Walt Whitman, and he himself was a free verse poet. He thought of architecture as a form of poetry because it combines style and substance in ways that articulate a single vision and employs formal structures, particularly rhythm, to heighten the significance of what is said. Quote, "In man's rhythmical adjustment of nature lies happiness," Sullivan said. "It is the function of the poet to examine the myriad progeny of nature and make them his own." Now, Wright would later change this metaphor a little bit and argue that architecture isn't poetry but music, which establishes a framework with rhythms and plays freely upon that framework with melodies and themes that give it life and unity. Now, implicit in this idea that architecture is poetry or music is the principle of integration. Most buildings in Sullivan's day had an eclectic style that assembled pre-selected components together like choosing parts out of a catalog. For instance, he pointed out that the Montgomery Ward building in Chicago has 4 different towers stacked sequentially. This was anathema to Sullivan, who thought that buildings should have one central integrating principle and grow naturally from that single design theme. Sullivan's name for his vision was organic architecture, a phrase that Wright would adopt as his own. Sullivan said, quote, "The popular method of architecture, of merely setting together ready-made fragments, is a mechanical, not an organic process. It may tax the mind, for it is essentially a species of unwholesome compromise, but it finds no place for the exercise of the higher faculties of thought and feeling. A great work is always a great individual expression, the expression of a single thought, or a single mood, born of a contemplative, active, clear-sighted, creative mind." Now, it's worth pausing to observe that Sullivan's and Wright's belief that architecture is like poetry or music explains why architecture is an art form at all. Art is a selective recreation of reality in accordance with an artist's metaphysical value judgments. That means it's a selective representation or representation of the world that's consistent with the artist's basic notions about what is important in life. It's obvious how a movie or a novel or a narrative poem recreates reality because they create facsimile worlds. But what about music or a non-narrative poem like Rudyard Kipling's If? The answer is that these art forms select or present sound or metaphors or connotations in ways that trigger emotional effects, possibly because the mind associates them with physical movements that have emotional significance. That's why music is so closely associated with dance, or even with just tapping your feet. And that enables music to represent physical movement or stillness and the personal emotional atmospheres, or so to speak, flavors, that we associate with those motions or with that stillness. And architecture does something similar. Instead of musical notes or vocabulary, it uses 3-dimensional elements to recreate a sense of emotionally charged movement or stillness. It's no coincidence that we speak of sweeping curves, or flying buttresses, or dramatic towers, and so forth. Stationary structures can convey dynamic properties charged with emotion, just like human gestures. What reality does architecture recreate? It represents selectively stylized versions of the environment using techniques that render in a physical shape, space, and the implications of motion the sense of a world, whether modern or antique, bright or gloomy, streamlined or full of curious nooks and crannies. And we evaluate the significance of that represented environment just as we evaluate the significance of the mental effects that music or non-narrative lyric poetry accomplish. It's true, architecture is utilitarian, but, lots of writing has utilitarian functions also. Architecture's visual rhythms and harmonies, its repetitions, its smoothness, its abruptness, its tones of steel or stone or wood accomplish the same thing. Where music uses our sense of hearing, architecture uses our sense of proprioception, or our visuospatial capacity, that is, our sense of space. Now, the principle of integration gave rise to Sullivan's famous and misunderstood slogan, "Form follows function." Later generations of architects would interpret this phrase as an attack on ornamentation and argued that buildings should be stripped down to their basic and essential forms. But this was basically the opposite of what Sullivan meant. In fact, he was probably the greatest of all practitioners of ornament. Consider the elaborate ornamentation on his Carson Priory Scott building in Chicago. What Sullivan meant was not that buildings should be reduced to their functional parts, but that the function should inspire the form and be articulated by the form. For Sullivan, ornamentation on a building was like lace lingerie on a beautiful woman. It highlights and accentuates the form. The simplest way to put it is that for Sullivan, the form expressed the structure, but did not reveal the structure. Neither Sullivan nor Wright would adhere to the misunderstanding of form follows function that was embraced by the so-called international school of architects, who reduced buildings to their simplest and least individualistic components. Sullivan thought architecture was poetry. The international school thought that it should be prose. Sullivan's two ideas, that the importance of the arch and the idea of architecture as poetry, brought about the greatest controversy of his life, because the reigning orthodoxy of his day was neoclassicism, the idea that American architects should try to make buildings that resembled Greco-Roman styles. Sullivan made war on neoclassicism, which was championed by the American Institute of Architecture, and his biggest battle came at the Chicago World's Fair of 1893. The fair was held in an artificial city made up of temporary buildings, designed by a committee led by Sullivan's arch nemesis, Daniel Burnham, most famous for the Flatiron Building in Manhattan. Burnham decreed that the fair should be built in neoclassical style, and the committee complied, constructing the famous White City of imitation Greek and Roman temples. Sullivan refused to cooperate. He called neoclassicism snobbish and alien to the land. It was an authoritarian architecture that turns its back on man, he said, lost in ghostly misalliance with abstractions, when what the world needs is courage, common sense, and human sympathy, and a moral standard that is plain, valid, and livable. He participated in the fair, but he built his transportation building not in a classical style, but in a long horizontal form with gigantic arched entrances, the so-called golden doorway, colored in spectacular yellows and reds. And Sullivan lost the war. The architectural profession embraced Burnham's neoclassicism, just as technology was making it possible to construct genuine skyscrapers that articulated a single idea. America's builders decided to imitate Greek temples, medieval castles, and French chateaux, trying to de-emphasize the height of their buildings. Compare Sullivan's own tall building, the 1896 Guarantee Building in Buffalo, which proudly asserts its height with bold vertical lines decorated with fine lacework, with the St. Paul Building by George Post a year later, which tries to downplay its height by breaking up the shaft and emphasizing the horizontal. Sullivan thought this kind of architecture was artificial, unreal, and positively pernicious. The remedy, he said, was self-evident. He said, a liberation of the creative impulse, to which the president of the American Institute of Architects, Robert Peabody, responded, quote, "Most of us shudder to think what our land would be if subjected to a liberation of the creative impulse." Sullivan was destined to die in 1924, lonely, bankrupt, and alcoholic. Wright left Sullivan's office in 1893 to start his own practice, focusing primarily on building houses, which was something Sullivan didn't really have much interest in. Although Wright did later build important public projects, such as the Johnson Wax Building and the Guggenheim, his finest work was always residences. And there's something very revealing about the fact that America's greatest architect was, first and foremost, a builder of private homes. Once on his own, Wright began developing his distinct style, which would break with the prevailing Victorian eclecticism of his day. And in doing that, he was influenced not only by Sullivan, but also by another movement that was gaining momentum at the time called the arts and crafts movement. Arts and crafts started in the late 19th century as a reaction against the rise of machinery in Europe and the United States. The craftsmen, as they were called, thought mechanization was creating a dehumanizing world, soulless and inauthentic. Does this sound familiar to you? Preferring traditional handmade construction, they aimed to build with wood and stone instead of steel and glass, and to highlight natural handmade qualities in their work, on the theory that this was a defense of individual integrity against the regimentation and automation that they associated with the machine. and their work was often quite beautiful. For example, the Gamble House and the Blacker House by the greatest craftsman architects, the Green brothers. Notice the exposed beams holding up the roofs and porches, and the stones making up the hearths and fireplaces as a way of conveying naturalness and human scale. The craftsman influence on Wright has not been sufficiently appreciated, but you can't visit his houses and not be struck by the degree to which Wright borrowed from their techniques, especially his preoccupation with the horizontal, which would become one of his chief hallmarks. Yet Wright rejected their hostility to mechanization. In 1901, he delivered an important speech called The Art and Craft of the Machine, which argued that the advent of machinery did not need to spell the end of individualism. Quote, "The machine is intellect mastering the drudgery of earth that the plastic art might live. Its function is ultimately to emancipate human expression. The machine is capable of carrying to fruition high ideals in art, higher than the world has ever seen." Thus, Wright would employ the humanizing touches of the craftsman while welcoming and celebrating rather than despising technology. And from these ingredients, Wright managed to create the breakthrough style that combined the individualism and the integrity of Sullivan with the simplicity and privacy of the craftsman. It employed techniques borrowed from Europe and Asia, but it was a distinctively American style, and he called it the prairie style. Scholar Donald Hoffman explains the style by the presence of three characteristics: the cantilever, the rift, and the pier, which together help propel the spirit into the landscape. The cantilever, as we have seen, is like a bridge with only one leg. It projects the horizontal line into space as if hovering. It connects with the earth, but with a sense of lightness that defies gravity. By rift, Hoffman means the separation of a wall in ways that make the structural load seem to disappear, whether horizontal or vertical. Wright's famous friezes of glass, or his corner windows, for example, are rifts that defy the expectations by making the weight of the roof seem to vanish and giving buildings an airy, nonchalant quality instead of the heaviness of columns in the corners. And pier refers to vertical wall sections that may bear no load at all, but give a sense of solidity and command when they're strategically placed around the structure and make the building seem to grow out of the site instead of being plopped down on top of it. Piers are especially helpful in creating a sense of rhythm and integrating the parts into the whole. Consider what I believe to be the greatest of the prairie houses, the Roby House in Chicago. Its immense cantilevered roofs with their low angles give it a powerful horizontal design theme. The walls around the exterior, instead of just being boring right angles, are broken into multiple rectangular sections, that is piers, that cast striking vertical shadows like a mountain range that disappears over the horizon. And the strip of windows sheltered underneath that big cantilevered roof helps the weight of the ceiling seem to disappear. On the inside, Wright developed the open plan so that the home is no longer a collection of box-shaped rooms, but flows from place to place. Most striking of all is the integration. Every part belongs to the whole and draws out the horizontal design theme. One marvelous touch is the unusually long bricks that subtly draw out the length of the house. Even the armrests on the couch in the living room are cantilevered out to go with the whole house. Now, Wright built the prairie houses at the rate of about one a month in the 1900s. In 1903, he built one for a client named Edwin Cheney. While that construction was underway, he fell in love with Cheney's wife, Mama, and the two ran away to Europe together, leaving behind not only Edwin, but also Wright's wife, Catherine, and their 6 children. Catherine refused to give Wright a divorce, and the scandal made national headlines. But that was nothing compared to what followed next. In 1910, Wright and Mama moved to Taliesin, Wright's home in Wisconsin. Wright began working on a major project in Chicago, and one day in 1914, while he was away in that city, a workman at Taliesin murdered Mama and her 2 children, as well as 6 other people with an axe, and burned the house to the ground. He committed suicide without ever revealing why he did it. It was partly to escape these shattering horrors that Wright traveled to Japan to build the Imperial Hotel in Chicago, which was completed in 1923. Like the craftsman architects before him, Wright was in awe of Japanese design. He admired the simplicity and the connection to the environment. Japanese style was in some ways the opposite of the Victorian, where the Victorian was vertically oriented, cluttered, ornate, boxy, artificial, and fantastical. By the way, I grew up in that greenhouse in the picture there, which is in Los Angeles. The Japanese style is simple, horizontal, plain, even stark, low to the ground, with the difference between inside and outside sometimes hard to discern. Japanese style downplayed the importance of personal possessions and highlighted the individual's relationship to nature. If architecture was poetry, Japanese architecture was haiku. And Wright loved the extraordinary minimalism and the accentuation of every detail. This is the Taliesin West in Nikko, Japan. Notice the emphasis on the roof with its sweeping horizontals and the concealment of the vertical supports. Instead of feeling boxy, it feels like sheltering arms low over the ground. This helped inspire Wright's Unity Temple in Chicago, which was completed in 1906. Now, the Unity Temple doesn't look anything like Taliesin West from the outside. In fact, the exterior is more about piers than about cantilevers, but the floor plan is almost identical. More importantly, the building is low-slung. There's no steeple. This is about life and the here and now. And on the inside, Wright used a series of tricks that make the walls seem to fall away. Interior piers are separated from the walls by rifts, and with low, sweeping balconies at the bottom and the band of windows called a clear story at the top. It would be easy to miss the walls entirely. You enter through the side, you walk around the main room before you rise up into it, and once seated, the overhanging balconies and the clear stories give you the sense of being in a gazebo more than being inside a square building. Simply put, Wright's temple rejects the authoritarian and mystical qualities of traditional church architecture and substitutes instead humanist qualities. Worshippers look at each other not at an altar, and they're across horizontally instead of vertically. Wright called this a temple to the human spirit. Does that sound familiar? Another important Wright technique featured prominently in Unity Temple was what architects call compression and release. By diminishing the size of entryways and hallways and then stretching out the height of a main room, Wright could control your sensations when moving through a building, pressuring you to move down a narrow hallway and then rewarding you with inspiration when you reach your destination. And Wright loved this trick. For one thing, he was only 5'7", and he was often teased for making doorways too low for average people, to which he would often reply that a 6-foot-tall man was a waste of material. But the real reason he did this was that restriction and then expansion serves the goal of creating psychological sensations in his buildings, just as a musical composer can use a fast beat or a loud crescendo to raise a sense of urgency or a quiet minor key to convey melancholy. Shortly after he returned from Japan in the 1920s, Wright became involved with a new woman, a schizophrenic drug addict named Miriam Noel. His wife, Catherine, finally gave him a divorce in 1922, and he married Miriam, only to have that relationship deteriorate into abuse. So by 1924, he had met a third woman, the woman who would become his last wife, Olga Vana. And when Miriam found out that they were living together at the newly rebuilt Taliesin, she had him arrested for transporting a woman across state lines for immoral purposes, which was then a federal crime. And that story also became a national scandal. Olga Vana barely escaped being deported. Then, in 1925, Taliesin burned to the ground again. 2 years later, Wright finally got a divorce from Miriam and married Olga Vana, but by then his finances had been wrecked and he was bankrupt. Another man might have given up. Wright was already in his 60s by this point. He had transformed American architecture and become world famous with the prairie style. Now his reputation had been destroyed and he was penniless. He might have retired. Instead, he decided to remake himself. In 1927, he was invited to build a luxury hotel here in Phoenix. And when he came out to see the site, he met a real estate developer named Alexander Chandler who wanted him to build another hotel in the nearby town that's named after him. Wright settled there in Chandler, Arizona, living for 6 months in a campsite that he built at a spot exactly 15 minutes south of here. That Chandler hotel was never built. But Wright's first project became one of Arizona's great architectural treasures, the Arizona Biltmore. Wright was not officially the architect of the Biltmore. For legal reasons, he was the consulting architect for Albert Chase MacArthur, but his influence is obvious in every detail, particularly the striking textile blocks, which is an idea he had started playing with in California in the 1920s with a group of houses that he called his romanza homes. This second phase of Wright's career includes the famous Ennis House in Los Angeles, which you might remember from the film Blade Runner, and La Miniatura in Pasadena. Wright's romanza style is best understood by an analogy. It was to California what the prairie style was to the Midwest, a new architecture that would express the California climate and geography, as well as the advent of the Hollywood movie industry, while also hearkening back to Mayan and Mexican temples. Now, in formulating the romanza style, Wright was influenced by one of the most important incidents in the history of architecture, the 1922 competition to design a new headquarters building for the Chicago Tribune. That contest was won by John Mead Howells and Raymond Hood, whose Tribune Tower is, well, infamous for its ridiculous column, a crown of Gothic flying buttresses at the top. Talk about useless. Wright hated skyscrapers. Remember, he thought buildings should be low to the ground, and he refused to participate in any competitions. But he and all the other architects were blown away by the second place entry in the competition, Eliel Saarinen's neo-Gothic Art Deco Mayan temple, which is one of the most influential buildings never constructed. Wright thought that Los Angeles, with its connection on one hand to Mexico and on the other to the fantasy world of Hollywood, begged for an exotic architecture that combined the mystery of a castle with the glamour of make-believe, and Saarinen's design offered the key. Thus, Wright developed the romanza style. His first attempt came with Los Angeles' famous Hollyhock House, finished in 1921. Notice how it employs the horizontal lines and the open plan of the prairie style, but it adds these Art Deco versions of flower motifs throughout a house that is so castle-like that it even features a drawbridge and a moat around the living room fireplace. That actually is filled with water around the fireplace. The feature never worked, so they covered it up pretty quickly after he built it. 8 years after that, with the Arizona Biltmore, Wright was a little more restrained. Here, too, he uses textile blocks and the open plan of the lobby with its overhanging second story, lowered ceilings, the constraint and release technique, the integrated light fixtures, which give it a uniquely relaxed, exotic look. But there was something new also. While working on the Biltmore, Wright fell in love with the desert. He called Arizona the land of the dotted line, meaning that architecture here must employ dotted lines and wall surfaces that eagerly take the light and play with it, break it up and render it harmless, or drink it until sunlight blends the building into place with the creation around it. That's a quote. For the rest of his career, Wright would design parts of his structures solely for the purpose of casting shadows, helping to create interesting linear effects that would echo the crags and boulders and the points of cactuses, just as his prairie style had echoed the flatness of the Great Plains, and his romanza style had expressed the fantasy and nostalgia of Hollywood. A decade later, he would put all of these ideas into practice when he bought land up near Scottsdale and began construction of his winter house, Taliesin West. But the 1930s would be hard for Wright. The Biltmore was finished just in time for the Great Depression, and commissions quickly vanished. But between 1925 and 1930, he completed only 2 structures. And between 1930 and 1935, he completed only 2 more. It was not just that construction declined during the economic crisis. It was that the architectural profession was starting to turn away from his style and to embrace the ideas that were wholly contrary to his. This new rival would become Wright's greatest enemy. It was called the International Style. Its practitioners, such as Le Corbusier, Philip Johnson, and Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, rejected the individualism and humanism of Wright's organic architecture. They prioritized uniformity over uniqueness, standardization over individuality, and minimalism over the personality that Wright desired. Their motto was that a house is a machine for living, and their aesthetic was a top-down authoritarianism that elevated society over the individual. The socialist architecture critic Lewis Mumford described the International style's goals as, quote, disciplined thinking, coherent organization, collective enterprise, and happy impersonality. The Internationalists viewed their work as part of an effort to transform people in the service of politics. Corbusier adopted the slogan, architecture or revolution. The idea being that architecture could change people, including by making them more peaceful. Of course, one way to do that is to eliminate their individuality, which is, after all, the cause of so much conflict. That called for a hygienic, even a sterile form of building. As Corbusier put it in his manifesto, quote, the sound economic management of building sites requires the exclusive use of straight lines. The straight line is the grand acquisition of modern architecture. We must clear our minds of romantic cobwebs, end quote. This seemed to imply exactly the dehumanizing mechanization that the craftsmen had feared, right? The buildings were just glass and steel boxes, and the people inside were just animals to be controlled, not individuals to be respected. In fact, the Internationalists appealed to the culture of collectivism. Quote, architecture which produces effects introduced by the artist has no right to exist, declared the Swiss architect Hans Meyer, who was a guru to the Internationalists. Quote, building is only organization, social, technical, economic, and mental. Well, nothing could have been more alien to Frank Lloyd Wright. He declared in an interview shortly before his death, quote, culture is not for the herd. Culture is an individual thing. The sovereignty of the individual means a certain rejection of the common man as common, but insisting on his privilege to be uncommon. This is the country that we live in that declares it, the only one that makes it official, the only one that has made it constitutional to be yourself, end quote. Now, it would be an exaggeration to characterize the division between Wright and the Internationalists as a clean-cut dichotomy. In fact, Wright approved some of their ideas and vice versa. He agreed with Corbusier, for example, that modern architecture should emphasize clean lines and the surfaces of the airplane, the ocean greyhounds, that is ships, and certain machinery. But the real problem was that there was no logical stopping point to the International style's simplification and functionalism until a building turned into merely a box like this. So anonymous and depersonalized that it might be plunked down anywhere in the world with no relationship to its surroundings and no sympathy to the inhabitants. One international style architect named Adolf Loos said, quote, the evolution of culture is synonymous with the removal of ornament from utilitarian objects, end quote. And that attitude appealed to builders who thought that decoration or a concern with beauty or the human spirit were decadent bourgeois distractions from the task of mass-producing uniform machines for living. These ideas led Wright to call the International style affected simplicity and a sterility of ornophobia. International buildings, he said, quote, utterly fail to make their virtues honorably or humanly effective. We might as well trim up the trees, too, and cut them into cubes and triangles. We are eventually going to have citizens, machine-made men, corollary to machines, if we don't look out, end quote. Well, in that collectivist era, it was inevitable that Wright would be an outcast. In 1929, a prominent critic called him a, quote, old romantic. And Vanity Fair magazine ran an article that dismissed him as, quote, an aging individualist, end quote. In fact, many intellectuals viewed romanticism and individualism as passé. In the modern proletarian age, they were embracing the communist murals of Diego Rivera, the geometrical paintings of Kandinsky, the atonal music of Stravinsky and Schoenberg, the naturalism and realism of novels by Sinclair Lewis and Theodore Dreiser. In their eyes, the coherence and elegance of Wright's architecture were inherently suspicious. As the architecture critic Henry Russell Hitchcock put it, Wright was, quote, pandering to the bourgeois taste for representational prettiness, end quote. In 1931, Hitchcock and Philip Johnson published The International Style, a manifesto which specified their principles as, quote, emphasis upon volume, space enclosed by thin planes or surfaces, as opposed to the suggestion of mass or solidity, regularity as opposed to symmetry or other kinds of obvious balance, and lastly, dependence upon the intrinsic elegance of materials, technical perfection, and fine proportions as opposed to applied ornament, end quote. The two authors acknowledged that, quote, commercially successful architects, end quote, would reject these ideas because they were, quote, contrary to the American cult of individualism, whether genuinely romantic, as in the case of Frank Lloyd Wright, or merely the result of the advertising value of the latest consumer product, end quote. Note the prejudice against anything that appeals to consumers or that people might enjoy simply for the sake of their loveliness. Now, Hitchcock and Johnson respected Wright's achievements, but they thought that his work, quote, belongs definitely to the past. The reason was that Wright insisted on, quote, remaining an individualist instead of submitting to the shackles of a fixed style. Other architects were, quote, working successfully within the disciplines. That is, they were obeying the rules. But nobody was building like Frank Lloyd Wright, and that, said Hitchcock and Johnson, quote, proved the case against individualism, end quote. Now, it's easy to laugh at this today, but the internationalists did have one valid objection to Wright's technique. He built beautiful homes for wealthy clients, but most people could never afford a tailor-made house by a world-famous designer. In a mass-produced age, an art like architecture, which aims to be useful as well as beautiful, risks being rendered irrelevant if people can't afford it. What good is it to write a gorgeous symphony if nobody can pay for the ticket to hear it? Simplicity and utilitarianism did seem appropriate concerns for the age of mass production, and especially given Wright's own devotion to democracy and machinery. All of this set the stage for the greatest comeback in the history of art. The first step came in 1937 when a young couple named Herbert and Catherine Jacobs asked Wright, who was now 70 years old, if he could build them a house for a mere $5,000, a little more than 5 years' pay for the average worker at the time. That was indeed a challenge, and Wright decided to try. The result was the Herbert Jacobs house, a modest one-story home of about 1,600 square feet, stocked with innovations to reduce cost and make the smallness livable. It used the open plan. It featured a minimum of internal walls, combined the dining room and the living room and the kitchen into one room, and used the ceiling height instead of the walls to convey a sense of separation. Wright used built-in furniture to reduce the need for storage space and installed a steam heating device in the floor to warm up the house. Instead of a garage, he invented the carport, probably Wright's most influential invention. But instead of bland steel and concrete, he built the house of wood and brick, which give it a human and natural feeling. Its low horizontal profile and its large windows tie it to the site in that signature Frank Lloyd Wright fashion. Wright was answering the challenge of the international style architects, and he even came up with a name for his third artistic phase. Instead of international, this was an American style. So he called it Usonian, which stands for United States of North America. It was the germ of what we call now mid-century modern. At the time, Wright was also building another building, the Johnson Wax headquarters in Racine, Wisconsin, a futuristic, streamlined structure that once again pushed the boundaries of what architects thought was possible. To support the ceiling of this main workroom, he designed these slender lily pad-shaped columns of reinforced concrete. Local building officials didn't think that they would work, so they refused to grant him a building permit. So Wright insisted on a public demonstration of his design. On June 4th, 1937, he had a test column erected and ordered sandbags piled on top. The load reached 6 times the weight that his plans called for before they finally cracked, as Wright walked around, occasionally whacking the shaft with his walking stick to demonstrate how stupid the bureaucrats were, and they finally gave in. A year later, of course, Wright unveiled his greatest masterpiece of all, a country retreat for a department store magnate named Edgar Kaufman on a stream in the forest near Pittsburgh. This house, known as Fallingwater, offered Wright's final and triumphant answer to the international school. It features the straight, modern simplicity that the internationalists liked, but here it's in the service of the individual, not in contradiction to the individual. This is the opposite of an anonymous machine for living. It is pure bourgeois prettiness. Falling water is situated so that it reveals itself slowly to the visitor who approaches from the forest. It makes no effort to disappear. Its stone verticals and pale concrete horizontals tie it to the site so that it seems to grow out of the rock. One of my favorite touches is this section here, which seems to clutch. It seems like a fist clutching onto the rock to hold the house to the hillside. This actually is not load-bearing. It has no structural support. It is pure decoration. Falling water is not a utilitarian structure. It features pieces that exist solely to cast shadows. There are more balconies than one needs. Do you ever really need a balcony? And Wright has broken all the walls into piers that act like screens. As Hoffman notes, falling water does not have 4 walls. It has 9 walls. This is the final word in organic architecture, structure as ornament, carrying a design theme of horizontals and verticals that rises in rhythm from the stone and the earth. Maybe the best way to appreciate falling water's triumph is to compare it with an international-style home, Richard Neutra's Lovell Health House in Los Angeles, which was built in 1929 and probably inspired falling water. The Health House has the same balconies and overhangs, but it's boxy, rigid, harsh, unconnected to the land. It lacks the flying qualities of falling water. And that's particularly due to one of Wright's most astonishing artistic choices. Note Neutra's foundational supports for this balcony. The little yellow arrow is pointing at these structural supports. They're very sensible and necessary, but they keep the structure cubical in its orientation. Wright decided to break the rules. His plan had originally called for 4 supports called bolsters underneath the main terrace, which he likened to the fingers of a waiter holding up a drink tray. But somewhere along the way, Wright eliminated one of the bolsters. As a result, the 3 that remain are hidden so far beneath the overhang that the viewer doesn't see them at all. This makes the cantilevered terrace appear to fly over the stream. It's a stroke of aesthetic genius. Of course, the downside is that the cantilever immediately started to sag, and in 2001, major repair work had to be done to prevent the house from collapsing. To the internationalists, this was decadence to the max, utterly unthinkable. This is not functionalism, this is romanticism. This is making a house not as it is, but as it might be and ought to be. Falling water vindicated Wright's reputation. By this time, he had established his apprenticeship program called the Taliesin Fellowship, both here and at Taliesin in Wisconsin. With his apprentices, he entered the most productive period of his life. In fact, 1/3 of the buildings that Wright constructed were built after he turned 80 years old. Many of these were Usonian homes, modest-sized houses of brick and wood featuring flat roof lines, high clear-story windows, carports, and unusual angles. Then came his final artistic phase, which involved a transition to circular architecture. In 1948, he built a small store in San Francisco called the Morris Gift Shop, which is dominated by a single 2-story round room that is connected by a single looping ramp. The windows are circular, and the light in the ceiling are all round. See that? Oops, I'm back up a little. See the ceiling lights are all these round things here. Wright was inspired for this design by a glass of champagne. The design theme is the bubbles that rise to the surface above. Until now, his work had always been angular and sharply horizontal, but for the final decade of his life, he incorporated these round motifs, including 2 houses here in Phoenix, the home that he built for his son David, and the Norman Likes house, also called the Circular Sun House. Now, the most famous of his circular structures is the Guggenheim in Manhattan. The idea here is that visitors would enter through a cramped doorway, right, constraint and release, into a single huge room, and then would ride an elevator to the top, and then descend down a single spiral ramp cantilevered out from the walls. Wright was forced to compromise many of the plans, and the finished work is not really what he intended. But scholars debate whether the Guggenheim is a success or not, because painters sometimes feel that their work is overshadowed by the architecture, which Wright would probably have loved. Wright's legacy is so pervasive today that it's hard to fully appreciate it. He taught and inspired many important architects, notably John Lautner, Richard Neutra, and Rudolf Schindler. Some of his students are still alive and practicing architecture, such as Vernon Swayback at Swayback and Associates here in Phoenix. This one here, the Sedona Moongate, is built up in Sedona near the Red Rocks. Isn't that gorgeous? Others, such as Michael Rust or the team at Druitt Works, or even Organic House Hakata in Japan, are keeping Wright's work alive in their own designs. Here's a building in my own neighborhood. I took this picture just a few weeks ago from a McDonald's parking lot across the street. Notice the Wright influences, the hipped roofs, the piers that don't connect to the roof, the clear rift, the band of windows there, the cantilevered roof lines. People hardly even notice that Wright is still speaking to us after all these years. Wright's influence can also be felt in subtler ways. For example, the concept of the atrium hotel, such as John Portman's famous lobbies at the Atlanta Hyatt or the Atlanta Marriott or the Los Angeles Bonaventure. They owe their origin to Wright, who in 1946 designed the Lacey Hotel for Dallas, Texas. It was meant to encompass an entire city block and feature a vast lobby of balconies rising to the sky, kind of like the Guggenheim. It was never built, but like many of Wright's unrealized designs, it inspired the next generation of builders. It would be hard to name an artist whose influence has been as ubiquitous as the rebel architect. Countless people live every day surrounded by structures that are based, at least in part, on his ideas. Carports, corner windows, aesthetic integration, the use of structure as ornament, expressive horizontality. Yet he achieved this universal influence not by lowering his standards, but through a devoted pursuit of his ideals. His work spoke for itself, and in the end, the nation heard. Architecture is man's great sense of himself embodied in a world of his own making, said Wright. His art made good on Louis Sullivan's promise of a new American architecture, and it transformed how people would express their uniqueness and pursue their uncommon lives. Thank you very much. All right, I can barely see, so we'll start here on the left. Yes?
All right, as someone who has devoted my productive life over the last decade to this field, I just wanted to say that I would have flown here from Wisconsin just for this talk alone. And also in homage to your John Singer Sargent talk last year, I'm wearing my Frank Lloyd Wright socks today.
Ah, excellent, very good. I got my Frank Lloyd Wright tie, but I don't have any Frank Lloyd Wright socks.
So my question is about function and organic architecture. Sullivan and Wright embodied organic architecture heavily in the work, and they drew so much from nature. But later on, Rand had her house built by Nitra, and the Fountainhead movie certainly depicted Rourke's architecture as being much more international, or at least devoid of ornament. So how is this concept lost, and why is function today synonymous with utilitarianism?
So let me start with Rand's attitude toward organicism in the Fountainhead. It is an interesting observation that, first of all, Rand loved skyscrapers, which Wright hated. Wright only built 2 tall buildings, and only one of them is really a skyscraper in Bartlesville, Oklahoma, the 15-story Price Tower. We're in the middle of absolutely nowhere. It has no justification being there except purely for beauty, and it is beautiful. Rand was actually drawn a lot, I think, to the international style. She liked the simplicity and straight lines and the pared down style of some of the internationalists. Incidentally, Le Corbusier, who is like the leading international style architect, really liked the Fountainhead and tried to meet Rand because he admired the book so much and he was very intrigued by it. So in 1937, when Fallingwater was first unveiled at a exhibit at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City, Rand probably went to see it at the time. She was working on the Fountainhead at that time. She probably went to see this exhibit, and she loved Fallingwater. In fact, in the Fountainhead, Fallingwater appears 3 times in the Fountainhead and in Anthem. In Anthem, when the character comes into the house and he mentions that there are no supports at the corners, there are just windows in the corners. So Rand adored Fallingwater. The rest of Wright's designs, Fallingwater is also kind of different than Wright's usual sort of thing. Fallingwater is more of Wright trying to do the international style. So Rand's own aesthetics were not completely in line with Wright. And Wright was more of this Emersonian, Jeffersonian kind of back to nature, kind of proto-hippie guy. And of course, Rand would have been uninterested in that. I expected that somebody would ask me about this, so actually I brought this slide. Can we show the slide again? So this is, Rand asked Frank Lloyd Wright to design a house for her after the fountainhead appeared, and he gave her this drawing of a cottage. It's pretty clear that this is just a preliminary idea. For one thing, it's not to scale. Notice the little tiny human figures there. That's an enormous building if that were really built. So he didn't really get very far in planning out this design, but it was based on a couple ideas he had already been playing with. Notice the similarity to the Elizabeth Noble Apartments that was designed in 1930, well before Rand even started working on the fountainhead. And you can notice the influence on Falling Water also. So Wright had been playing with ideas along these lines for quite a long time. So when Rand said, I really like Falling Water, I'd like to see something like it, he could, as he liked to say, he could shake house designs out of his sleeve whenever he felt like it, and he just whipped this out. Also notice a similarity to, he kept playing with this idea, the unbuilt point of view residences from 1952. Yes? Oh, I'm sorry, yes.
I don't know if this is working, but I'll ask.
I can actually hear you better without it, I think.
Okay. First of all, I'm going to thank for the opportunity to be here and asking this question. But my question is about the fact that freedom is often associated with the detriment of well-being, with the detriment of social equity. So considering this and the things you told here, how do you see the intersection between like this individualistic perspective, the pursuit of equality and architecture in the works of Frank? And do you believe that this individual expression and individuality in his own way can be, with the architecture, kind of a tool to achieve this like virtuous end?
So the tension between individualism and community living was something that Wright struggled with his entire life, actually. And he never really satisfactorily resolved it. His best effort to resolve it was a project that he called Broadacre City. Broadacre City was his proposal for town planning, and he even made this big model of what the city would look like, because he said he hated cities, right? And he was supposed to be this Jeffersonian, agrarian, back to the land, farming is great kind of a guy, right? So he's going to build this city that's going to be the city of the future that'll bring people back into connection with nature. And it's kind of neat to look at and everything. And then he adds in the fine print, he says, by the way, everybody who lives in Broadacre City, they're going to be governed by a board of architects who will have absolute power to decide what you're allowed to do in Broadacre City to make sure that it's consistent with the aesthetics of the place, right? So, totalitarianism. And Wright actually had a sort of, you might say, a sort of a seed of control, a seed of totalitarianism in his spirit, just a little bit. He would design everything about his houses sometimes, everything from the furniture to the placemats to the napkin rings, and at least on one occasion designed the dress that the women living in the house were supposed to wear. So and it is true that when you go into a Wright house, you live in his world. When he would visit clients, he would rearrange the furniture. If they had moved stuff, he would move it back to where he wanted it. So, no, it's prettier here, right? He put in these built-in, what he called built-ins, chairs and things that were built into the house, and he called it client-proofing. Because if he built the chair into the house, the client couldn't move the chair, and that way it would look prettier, So there's this real controlling quality to Wright's style, and I think there is a tension probably inherent in what he's trying to do to make an individualistic architecture that's also going to be spiritual and uplifting, but bring you into his world. And he never really resolved that, and I'm not really sure it's possible to resolve that completely. Incidentally, there are people who really harshly criticize Wright for not caring about the exterior of his buildings. Wright believed that the building should grow from the interior and express what goes on inside. And as a result, some of his houses really present a huge screen to the outside world. Like the Roby house is this big, it's basically this brick edifice with these little tiny windows, and it's, in a sense, it's like a keep out sign. And in fact, he never puts his front door on the front of the building. He conceals the entranceway of all of his buildings, so you have to walk around the house a couple times to get to the front door. Because he wants that privacy, that sense of individualism, that sense that you are on your own and free, which I find very poetically attractive. But you can see also why an entire community built out of Wright buildings, well, there are entire communities built of Wright buildings. He built some housing developments. They're all far separated from one another. He can't put them right next to each other. And that's a real tension. That's why, one reason why international style was adopted and became popular, not among average people. Americans, as a general rule, Americans hate international style architecture. It's so ugly. It's these hideous square boxes, and yet they're everywhere. Why? Because they're cheap, they're standard. Bureaucrats love them because they don't offend anybody, so that nobody goes down and pickets City Hall, and so they approve them. So you get stuck with this boxy, lame architecture that, of course, Wright just thought was just terrible. He hated it so much. Yeah?
Hey. So I just had a quick question. You just talked about internationals and how they're polar opposites, though I would definitely say they inspired each other to a certain degree. Especially Mies van der Rohe had a lot of open plan styles.
Yeah.
The Barcelona pavilion had like a very famous kind of floating roof that Frank also was inspired by, and the detail, he also had to a certain extent details, Mies van der Rohe in his buildings, and then the Edith Farnsworth building had a very open plan to invite nature in, so it has kind of also this harmony of inviting nature in, and Frank's later buildings, I would argue, also limit the amount of details he has in his building. For example, the Guggenheim, I would argue, have significantly less details than his earlier works had. So what do you think about the impressions they did on each other, the internationals on Frank and the other way around?
So that's a great question. Wright, I've been giving this easy dichotomy between Wright on one hand and the internationalists on the other hand, and it's not that simple. They did inspire each other. And as I mentioned, Wright admired some things about people like Corbusier, and although I say that international style is ugly, there are some pretty neat international style buildings. I think this one here, Barcelona Pavilion by Mies van der Rohe, I think that's delightful. It has this sense of lightness and openness to it. The idea, they would have said, the internationalists would have said, what they're trying to do is connect you with nature by eliminating the walls and making it all glass so that you feel like you're just sitting out there in the open land, right?
Yes.
Philip Johnson builds the glass house that's almost entirely just windows, right? Wright would have said, well, then where's the privacy? Individuality, you need privacy, he would have said. So they did inspire, and on one hand they inspired, but I think they also kind of threatened each other, and they were responding to each other. Also, Wright hated to admit that he had been influenced by anybody, right? You know, he claimed that every idea just came straight out of his head. He invented everything without any influence from anybody. He would have, when I said that the Lovell Health House influenced Fallingwater, he would have denied it, right? He hated the idea of admitting that somebody else, other than Louis Sullivan, whom he always praised as his great master, but he'd like to deny that he'd been influenced by anybody else. Yes?
Perfectly. So my question is not about like architecture, but more on the background that you provided in the speech. So in your speech, I noticed that there might be like an underlying assumption that the ideas of man in general, they're tied to the aesthetics. So we know that historically this association was popularized by the Romantic movement and Hegel, which many consider like the enemies of individualism and stuff. Do you agree with this view? If not, how do you interpret politicized aesthetics, and more in particular to the individualist stuff? We see that the concept of individualism in some ways might have been brought in a view that was more like a Marxian, bourgeoisie style, super capitalistic. Was that really in connection with the individualist tradition that we brought?
Wow, what a great question, and I'll tell you, you could write a whole book to answer that question. So I do think that the individual spirit expresses itself aesthetically, but I think that there are a great number of complexities about how you respond aesthetically to things. And I think it is possible for two people to look at a work of art and to love it or hate it for different reasons, even though that work is saying the same thing. And sometimes it can be very crude. Like, I think there are people who like, for instance, Like my wife loves horror movies. I don't much care for horror movies. But the reason she likes horror movies isn't because, she thinks life is dismal and horrific and it's fundamental. She likes it because there's a certain heightened importance to this, to horror stories. It's like, it's not just about the boy next door. This is a story that has some kind of meaning or power or intensity to it and stuff like that, right? I can see that, I can appreciate it, it just doesn't ring a bell for me. And I think there is a realm for saying that aesthetics it's not that it's subjective, it's that it's highly individual. And so I don't think that there's necessarily, you can't say, well, if you like this work, it's because your philosophical premises are this thing. Maybe, but there can also be other explanations that are equally valid. Also, I'll say about politicization of aesthetics, especially in architecture, we don't understand today how intense the fight over architecture was between about 1900 and 1945, let's say. One of the things was fascism. Fascism and this sort of attempt to make a modern classicism, right? If you look at the fascist architecture of Italy in the 1920s, or a lot of Washington, D.C. is fascist architecture because it was built just before World War II when this was still very fashionable. And there's this sort of attempt to modernize ancient Roman styles and things and give them this streamlined, futuristic look, even though it's an appeal to the past. And we've lost track of all of that. These things were intensely controversial at that time, and that's why Wright and the Internationalists were at each other, hammer and tongs sometimes, about what buildings were saying about us and what they should say about us in the future. It's such a complicated story that I couldn't summarize it here. I will urge all of you who are interested in this to get this little book by Tom Wolfe called From Bauhaus to Your House. It's published in, I think, the early 80s. Only about 100 pages long. You can get it, I think, for free on audible.com, I think. From Bauhaus, that's B-A-U-H-A-U-S, Bauhaus to Your House. And it's his indictment of international style architecture. He hates international style. He loves Wright. It's a lot of fun to listen to. And it's at least inspires a lot of thought, even if you disagree with it. I got 1 minute for one last question.
Great. Thank you so much for your talk. What are some ways we can modify or enhance our homes that we all currently live in to employ some of these individualistic principles that Mr. Wright?
Wow. My answer to that would be hire an architect. No, so I think Wright, what's the answer to that? Yeah, I'm not an architect, so I don't know how you should modify your house to embrace more of Wright's style. I will encourage you, if any of you have the time, and I hope you do, to go up to Scottsdale and take a tour of Taliesin West and take a look at a Wright building in person and ask the people there what they think. I live in, an ordinary tract home built by mass-produced designer, and we do our best to decorate it in ways that highlight ourselves. But Wright, I'm sure, if he came in, he would look around and say, "You should move out of this place." On the other hand, we could never live in a Frank Lloyd Wright house because being in a Wright structure, to me, is like being in a cathedral. It's like being in a church. You would have to sit with your back straight all the time. It's so elevating. You are in this room of, and I don't mean that it's stressful. I mean that it's serene and it's profound, and I would find that so distracting. I would never get anything done. I would be sitting there staring at my beautiful house all day. So, and of course, Wright houses are notorious for being just awful to maintain, extremely expensive because everything's tailor-made, so you can't buy anything off the shelf to repair, all this sort of stuff. But is it compensated by the incredible beauty of the structure? I leave that for you to decide. Thank you all very much for your time.